A broken rancher took in a desperate girl cast out by her own blood, never knowing she carried within her the miracle that would resurrect everything he'd buried with his wife and unborn child. 3 winters ago, the autumn wind cut through Colorado territory like a rusty blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would test every soul foolish enough to call this unforgiving land home. In the shadow of the Rockies, where the air grew thin and the nights bit with teeth of ice, stood the remnants of what had once been the most prosperous cattle ranch in Jefferson County.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Now the Broken Arrow Ranch bore scars deeper than drought. Could carve scars that bled from the heart of its owner, a man who had learned that some wounds never heal. They only learn to whisper in the wind. Samuel Holloway stood on the sagging porch of his ranch house, watching storm clouds gather above, the peaks like an army of dark angels. At 38, his face carried lines that belonged to a man 20 years older, etched by grief and carved by 3 winters of walking through life like a ghost haunting his own existence. His beard had grown wild and unkempt, streaked with premature gray that spoke of sleepless nights and endless questions hurled at an unforgiving God. The clothes that hung on his frame were clean but worn thin, patched in places where thorns and wire had torn at fabric that seemed determined to mirror the condition of the man who wore it. The ranch stretched before him in all directions. Thousands of acres that had once buzzed with the sound of lowing cattle and the laughter of ranch hands who believed in tomorrow. Now most of the pasture stood empty, fenced by wire that sagged like broken promises. The barn's red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and several of the outbuildings bore boards that had warped and split under the relentless assault of mountain weather. Only the main house remained solid, built by Samuel's father with hands that knew the secret of making things last. But even its sturdy log walls couldn't keep out the cold that lived inside Samuel's chest, a winter that had settled there the day he buried his wife, Margaret, and their stillborn son beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. The storm approaching now reminded him too much of that night 3 years ago when Margaret had gone into labor during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. The doctor couldn't make it through the snow-clogged passes, and Samuel had delivered his son alone while the wind howled like banshees around the house. The baby had come too early, too small, too quiet. Margaret had bled for hours while Samuel held their silent child, praying with a desperation that tore his throat raw. By morning, the storm had claimed them both, leaving Samuel with nothing but 2 graves and a ranch that felt as empty as his arms. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and turned to go inside when the sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind. A lone rider approached through the gathering dusk, hunched low against the bite of the approaching storm. As the figure drew closer, Samuel could see it wasn't one of his few remaining ranch hands returning from the high pastures. This rider moved with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing something worse than weather. The horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, its breath streaming like smoke in the frigid air. As it stumbled into the yard, Samuel could see the rider was small, wrapped in a tattered coat that had seen better decades. When the figure slid from the saddle and nearly collapsed, Samuel realized with a shock that it was a young woman, barely more than a girl, her face pale as fresh snow and her eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from staring death in the face and living to tell about it. She couldn't have been more than 18, with auburn hair that escaped from beneath, a worn wool cap and freckles that stood out like drops of rust against her bloodless cheeks. Her clothes were travel-stained and torn, and she clutched a small bundle against her chest as if it contained everything she owned in the world. When she looked up at Samuel, her green eyes held a mixture of hope and desperation that reminded him painfully of a wounded animal seeking shelter. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. "I need help. They said you might. That you were a good man who might." Her words dissolved into chattering teeth as her knees buckled beneath her. Samuel didn't hesitate. He'd seen enough suffering in his 38 years to recognize it in all its forms, and this girl carried pain like a heavy coat she couldn't shed. He caught her before she could fall, surprised by how light she felt in his arms, as if grief had hollowed her out the same way it had carved pieces from his own soul. Her skin was ice cold through the thin fabric of her coat, and he could feel her trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. "Easy now," he murmured, the first gentle words he'd spoken to another human being in months. "You're safe. Let's get you inside before this storm hits full force." He helped her into the house, noting how she moved with the careful gait of someone who'd been riding hard for too long. The interior of the ranch house was warm but sparse, furnished with the practical necessities of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort when comfort began to feel like betrayal. A fire crackled in the stone hearth that dominated one wall, and the main room held a sturdy oak table, 2 chairs, and a collection of books that had belonged to Margaret. Her presence still lingered in the careful arrangement of dried wildflowers in a mason jar and the quilt she'd stitched during their first winter as newlyweds. Now draped over the back of Samuel's chair, the girl's eyes took in every detail of the room with the quick assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate potential danger or safety in an instant. When her gaze landed on Margaret's photograph on the mantelpiece, something flickered across her face, recognition perhaps, or simply the universal understanding that this house had known love and lost it. "Sit," Samuel said, guiding her to the chair closest to the fire. "I'll get you something hot to drink." She sank into the chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight, still clutching that mysterious bundle against her chest. Samuel moved to the kitchen area, filling the kettle with water and setting it on the wood-burning stove. As he waited for it to heat, he studied his unexpected guest more carefully. She was pretty in the way wildflowers were pretty, natural and unpretentious, with a strength that seemed to grow from difficult soil. But her beauty was tempered by exhaustion and something deeper, a sadness that seemed too heavy for someone so young to carry. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice low and unthreatening as he spooned coffee grounds into a tin cup. "Rose," she said, her voice still shaky but growing stronger in the warmth of the house. "Rose McKenna. And where are you writing from, Miss McKenna?" It's dangerous to be traveling alone in this country, especially with a storm coming. Rose's hands tightened around her bundle, and Samuel noticed for the first time that it moved slightly, as if something alive rested within the folds of fabric. She followed his gaze, and her face flushed with a mixture of shame and defiance. "I came from Millfield," she said quietly. "My family... They cast me out. Said I brought shame on their name and wasn't welcome under their roof anymore." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd heard this story before, seen it played out in towns across the territory where judgment fell swift and merciless on young women who found themselves in trouble. The hypocrisy of it never failed to anger him. The same communities that preached Christian charity could turn their backs on those who needed it most. "They threw you out in weather like this?" The question came out harder than he'd intended, and Rose flinched. "They said God's wrath would follow me wherever I went," she whispered. "That I was cursed and would bring nothing but misfortune to anyone fool enough to help me." The kettle began to whistle, and Samuel poured the hot water over the coffee grounds, stirring them with more force than necessary. He'd heard enough sermons about God's wrath to last several lifetimes, most of them delivered by men who wouldn't know real suffering if it knocked down their church doors. In his experience, God's wrath was usually just an excuse for human cruelty. "What kind of help did you need?" he asked, bringing her the steaming cup. Rose accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm tin. "I heard tell in town that you were a decent man, that you'd lost your wife and might understand what it's like to lose everything." She took a sip of the coffee and closed her eyes as the warmth spread through her. "I don't have much money, but I can work.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
I can cook and clean and tend animals. I just need a place to stay until... She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the bundle in her lap. Samuel found himself staring at it as well, beginning to understand what he was looking at. The way she held it, the protective curve of her arms, the gentle rocking motion she'd begun without seeming to realize it. All of it pointed to one conclusion that made his chest tighten with a familiar ache. Until what, Miss McKenna? Rose looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own loss. His own desperate hope for something that might fill the empty spaces grief had carved in his heart. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet. He had to lean forward to hear her. Until my baby is born. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and making the room spin around him. He gripped the back of his chair, memories flooding through him with devastating clarity, Margaret's hand in his as she labored through. That terrible night, the weight of his stillborn son in his arms, the sound of dirt hitting 2 coffins beneath a sky the color of ash. For 3 years he'd carried the weight of that loss alone, and now this girl sat in his house, carrying life where he'd only known death. Rose watched his face change, saw the pain that flashed across his features like lightning illuminating a dark sky. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, starting to rise from her chair. "I shouldn't have come here. I didn't think about how it might affect you, losing your wife and child." "I'll go." "No." The word came out fierce and final, surprising. "Them both." Samuel straightened, his hand steady again as he looked at this girl who'd ridden through a storm to find sanctuary. "You're not going anywhere. Not in this weather, and not in your condition." He moved to the window and looked out at the storm. That was now unleashing its full fury on the valley. Snow fell in thick, driving sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet, and the wind howled around the house like a living thing seeking entry. No one could survive long in weather like this, especially not a pregnant girl on a half-dead horse. "You can stay in Margaret's sewing room," he said, turning back to Rose. "It's got a good bed and a window that catches the morning sun. I'll take care of your horse and get you some food." Rose stared at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done or why my family cast me out. I could be everything they said I was: cursed, shameful, trouble." Samuel walked to the mantelpiece and picked up Margaret's photograph, running his thumb across the glass that protected her smiling face. For 3 years, this house had been a tomb, and he'd been its only mourner, keeping vigil over memories and might-have-beens. But something in Rose's desperate courage, in her willingness to face the wilderness rather than accept her family's judgment, stirred something in him that he'd thought was buried as deep as his wife and son. "My Margaret always said that everyone deserves a second chance," he said finally. "She believed that God's mercy was bigger than human judgment, and that sometimes angels come disguised as troubles we don't think we can handle." He set the photograph back on the mantel and looked at Rose with eyes that held the first spark of life they'd shown in years. Maybe she was right. Outside, the storm raged with increasing violence, but inside the ranch house, something fundamental had shifted. 2 broken souls had found each other in the darkness, and though neither of them knew it yet, the child Rose carried would prove to be the miracle Samuel had prayed for every night since he'd buried his own hopes in the frozen ground. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but the shelter they'd found in each other would prove strong enough to weather whatever trials lay ahead. The blizzard raged for 3 days and nights, turning the world beyond the ranch house into a white void where sound was swallowed and direction became meaningless. During those long hours trapped inside, Samuel discovered that having another human presence in his home was both a blessing and a torment he hadn't anticipated. For 3 years he'd grown accustomed to the silence, to the way his own footsteps echoed through rooms that had once been filled with Margaret's humming and the rustle of her skirts. Now, Rose's quiet movements through the house created a symphony of small sounds that awakened memories he'd buried deep. She was remarkably self-sufficient for someone who'd arrived half-frozen and desperate. On the first morning after the storm began, Samuel had awakened to find her already dressed and tending the fire, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage a household from necessity rather than choice. She'd found Margaret's apron hanging in the kitchen and tied it around her small waist, the sight of which had stopped Samuel cold in the doorway, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "I hope you don't mind," Rose had said, noticing his stare. "I wanted to make myself useful, and I found eggs in the henhouse. The chickens didn't seem to mind the snow much." Samuel had nodded, unable to trust his voice. Watching Rose move around his kitchen in Margaret's apron was like seeing a ghost made flesh, but not in the painful way he'd expected. Instead, it felt like the house was slowly remembering how to breathe again. As the days passed, Samuel began to notice details about his houseguest that intrigued and puzzled him in equal measure. Rose was educated. That much was clear from the way she spoke and the fact that she could read the books in Margaret's collection with obvious enjoyment. But her hands told a different story, marked with calluses and small scars that spoke of hard physical labor. She cooked with the confidence of someone who'd been feeding people for years, yet she was barely 18 by his estimation. Most puzzling of all was the way she sometimes caught herself humming melodies that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the frontier settlements of Colorado Territory. On the second day of the storm, while Rose dozed in the chair by the fire, Samuel had noticed a small leather journal protruding from her coat pocket. The urge to look at it had been almost overwhelming, not from nosiness, but from a growing need to understand this girl who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he'd been afraid to voice. But something in the protective way she'd clutched that journal even in sleep had stayed his hand. Everyone was entitled to their secrets, especially those who'd been driven from their homes by the judgment of others. What he could observe was that Rose was clearly well into her pregnancy, though she tried to hide it beneath loose clothing and careful posture. Samuel estimated she was perhaps 6 months along, which meant the child would be born sometime in the depths of winter. The thought filled him with a mixture of anticipation and terror that he didn't fully understand. Part of him longed to help, bring new life into the world, to redeem somehow the failure he felt at being unable to save his own son. But another part feared that history would repeat itself, that he would once again find himself holding a still, cold form while the wind howled its mockery outside. Rose seemed to sense his internal struggle without him saying a word. On the morning of the third day, as they shared breakfast while the storm began to show signs of weakening, she looked up from her plate of eggs and biscuits with those perceptive green eyes that seemed to see far too much. "You're afraid," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Samuel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Of what?" "Of what might happen when my time comes. You're thinking about your wife, about your son." The directness of her observation caught him off guard. Most people in the territory had learned to avoid mentioning his loss, treating it like a wound too tender to touch. But Rose spoke of it with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd known her share of pain. "You don't know what you're talking about," Samuel said. But the words lacked conviction. Rose set down her fork and leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love more than your own life. I know what it's like to blame yourself for things that were never your fault to begin with." She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "And I know what it's like to be terrified that God might take away the one thing you've got left to hope for." Samuel stared at her, shaken by the accuracy of her words. "Who did you lose?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Her face went through a series of subtle changes, pain, longing, and finally a kind of resigned sadness that made her look far older than her years. My brother, she said finally. Thomas. He was 2 years older than me, and he was everything good in our family. Kind, gentle, always standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Her voice grew soft with memory. He died trying to save a child who'd fallen through ice on the river. Got the boy out, but the cold water ... She shook her head. He lasted 3 days before the fever took him. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight band of isolation he'd wrapped around his heart. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. After Thomas died, everything changed. My parents became hard bitter. They started going to church twice a week and seeing sin everywhere they looked. She gestured vaguely at her condition. When this happened, they said it was God's punishment for our family's wickedness. That Thomas died because we weren't faithful enough, and now I'd brought fresh shame on his memory. The anger that rose in Samuel's throat was swift and fierce. He'd seen this kind of twisted faith before, the way some people used religion as a weapon against those who were already wounded. That's not God talking, he said firmly. That's fear and grief looking for someone to blame. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. You sound like Thomas. He always said that God was love, not judgment. That if people really knew God's heart, they'd spend more time helping and less time condemning. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the storm outside beginning to quiet to occasional gusts, rather than the constant howl it had maintained for days. Samuel found himself studying Rose's face, noting the strength in the set of her jaw, and the intelligence in her eyes. She was stronger than she looked, this girl who'd ridden through a blizzard to escape the cruelty of those who should have protected her. The father of your child, Samuel said carefully, is Achi. Does he know? Rose's face hardened instantly, a wall slamming down behind her eyes. He knows. He also knows that acknowledging it would ruin his reputation and his engagement to a respectable girl from a wealthy family. The bitterness in her voice cut like a blade. He made it very clear that if I ever spoke his name in connection with this child, he'd make sure I was run out of every decent town from here to California. Samuel's hands clenched into fists on the table. The picture she painted was all too familiar, a story as old as time itself, where men escaped the consequences of their actions while women bore the shame and responsibility alone. What's his name? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. It doesn't matter, Rose said quickly, recognizing the threat in his tone. He's nothing to me now, and he'll be nothing to this child. We're better off without him. Before Samuel could respond, a new sound cut through the relative quiet of the diminishing storm, the distant lowing of cattle in distress. Samuel's head snapped up, his rancher's instincts immediately alert. He'd been so focused on the storm and his unexpected house guest that he'd almost forgotten about the small herd he still maintained in the lower pastures. I have to check on the cattle, he said, rising from the table. They've been out in this weather for 3 days. Rose stood as well, moving toward the window to peer out at the snow-covered landscape. I'll come with you. Absolutely not. You're in no condition to be trudging through snowdrifts, and I won't have you risking your health or your child's for the sake of a few cows. The firmness in his voice brooked no argument, but Rose turned from the window with a stubborn set to her shoulders that reminded Samuel of Margaret when she'd made up her mind about something. I grew up on a farm, Samuel Holloway. I know cattle, and I know what it looks like when animals are in trouble. You'll need help, and I'm the only help you've got right now. Samuel opened his mouth to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. There was a determination there that spoke of someone who'd been forced to be self-reliant long before circumstances had driven her to his door. And if he was honest with himself, the thought of leaving her alone in the house, while he ventured out into the aftermath of the storm, made him uneasy in ways he couldn't fully explain. You stay close to me at all times, he said finally. And If I tell you to go back to the house, you go. No arguments." Rose nodded, already moving toward the pegs by the door where her coat hung. Agreed. They spent the next several hours digging through snowdrifts and following the distressed sounds of the cattle. Samuel's small herd had sought shelter in a grove of cottonwoods near the creek, but several of the animals were showing signs of exposure and stress. Working together, they managed to guide the cattle to the barn, where Samuel could provide them with hay and ensure they had access to unfrozen water. Rose proved to be as capable as she'd claimed, moving among the animals with quiet confidence and an obvious understanding of their needs. She helped Samuel identify which cattle needed immediate attention and assisted him in treating minor injuries and signs of frostbite. Despite her pregnancy, she worked tirelessly, never complaining about the cold or the physical demands of the task. It was while they were working to free a young bull, whose hoof had become trapped in a fallen branch, that Samuel noticed something that made him pause. Rose was humming again, that same melody he'd heard her sing while cooking, and the sound of it seemed to calm the distressed animal in a way that surprised him. The bull, which had been thrashing and bellowing in panic, gradually settled under the soothing influence of her voice. "Where did you learn that song?" Samuel asked as they finally managed to free the animal's trapped hoof. Rose looked up at him, snowflakes clinging to her eyelashes. "My grandmother taught it to me," she said. It was an old lullaby from Ireland, something her own grandmother had sung to her children. She wiped her gloved hand across her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. Grandmother always said that music had power to heal, to comfort. She claimed that animals could understand the language of the heart, even when they couldn't understand words. Samuel filed this information away, adding it to the growing collection of details that painted a picture of Rose's background. Irish heritage might explain her coloring and some of her mannerisms, but it raised new questions about how she'd ended up in a frontier settlement like ILLFIELD. By the time they finished with the cattle, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, turning the landscape into a glittering wonderland that was both beautiful and treacherous. Samuel and Rose made their way back to the house, both exhausted but satisfied with their work. As they stamped snow from their boots on the porch, Rose suddenly stopped and placed her hand on her belly, a look of wonder crossing her face. Samuel felt his heart skip a beat, afraid that something was wrong. But then Rose smiled, the first truly joyful expression he'd seen from her since her arrival. "He's moving," she said softly, "really moving." I think all that activity woke him up. Without thinking, Samuel reached out his hand, then stopped, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture. Rose saw his hesitation and, after a moment's pause, took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. The feeling of life beneath his palm hit Samuel like a physical blow. The child's movement was strong and deliberate, as if announcing his presence to the world. For a moment, Samuel was transported back 3 years to a similar moment with Margaret, when their son had first made his presence known. But instead of the crushing grief he expected to feel, he was surprised by a surge of hope, so powerful it left him breathless. "He's strong," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "He?" Rose asked, raising an eyebrow. Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. I assumed. Rose laughed, the sound bright and clear in the crisp air. "I think you're right, actually. The way he moves, the way he kicks, it feels like a boy." Her expression grew thoughtful. "I've been calling him Thomas, after my brother. Thomas Samuel, if that would be all right with you." The use of his name as part of the child's name hit Samuel with unexpected force. In that moment, standing on his porch with his hand on Rose's belly and the winter sun turning her hair to copper fire, he realized that something fundamental had changed in his heart. This girl and her unborn child were no longer just refugees he was sheltering from the storm. They were becoming something more, something that felt dangerously close to family. Thomas Samuel, he repeated, testing the sound of it. I think that's a fine name for a boy. As they went inside to warm themselves by the fire, Samuel found himself wondering what other surprises Rose McKenna might have in store for him. She was proving to be far more complex than the desperate girl who'd collapsed in his yard 3 days ago. There were depths to her story that he was only beginning to glimpse, and mysteries in her past that she guarded as carefully as she guarded her unborn child. But for the first time in 3 years, Samuel found himself looking forward to discovering those mysteries. The house that had been a tomb was slowly coming back to life, and the man who had been buried alive with his wife and son was beginning to remember what it felt like to hope. Winter settled over the Colorado Territory like a patient predator, bringing with it a silence so profound that every sound seemed magnified tenfold. The weeks following the great storm passed in a rhythm that Samuel had never experienced before, not the hollow routine of his grieving years, but something richer and more complex. Rose had become an integral part of the ranch's daily operations, her presence transforming not just the house but Samuel's entire approach to living. The transformation began in small ways that Samuel barely noticed at first. Rose had a gift for organization that brought order to corners of the house that had descended into bachelor chaos. She reorganized Margaret's herb garden notes and began planning what they might plant come spring. Her excitement about the future, infectious in ways that caught Samuel off guard. She mended his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and somehow she coaxed flavors from their simple ingredients that made every meal feel like a celebration. But it was Rose's way with the animals that truly amazed Samuel. She had an almost mystical ability to calm even the most fractious beasts with nothing more than her voice and gentle hands. The ranch's old horse, Thunder, had been skittish and difficult since Margaret's death, refusing to allow anyone near. Enough for proper grooming. Yet within days of Rose's arrival, the massive bay gelding was following her on the corral like a devoted dog, nickering softly whenever she appeared. It's like she speaks their language, Samuel confided to his foreman, Jake Martinez, during one of the older man's rare visits to check on the herd. Jake had worked the Holloway Ranch for 15 years and had known Margaret well. His weathered face showed approval as he watched Rose gently coax a limping mare into the barn for treatment. Some folks got the gift, Jake said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. Your Margaret, she had it too, but different. Margaret could gentle a horse with patience and understanding. This girl, she's got something else, like the animals trust her because they know she's carrying life. Samuel pondered Jake's words as he watched Rose work. There was indeed something almost sacred about the way creatures responded to her, as if they sensed the miracle growing within her and recognized her as one of their own protective spirits. Even the ranch's collection of barn cats, usually wary of strangers, had taken to following Rose around in a small parade, purring and winding around her legs as she went about her daily tasks. The bond between Samuel and Rose deepened through shared work and quiet conversations by the fireplace. Rose proved to be remarkably well-read, and her insights into the books in Margaret's collection often surprised Samuel with their depth and originality. She had opinions about everything from the poetry of Walt Whitman to the philosophical implications of Darwin's theories, and she wasn't shy about expressing viewpoints that challenged Samuel's own assumptions. One evening in mid-December, as they sat reading by lamplight while wind rattled the windows, Rose looked up from a volume of Emerson's essays with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever wonder if we're meant to find the people who need us most when we need them most? She asked. Samuel set down his own book and studied her face, noting the way the firelight played across her features and made her red hair glow like burnished copper. What do you mean? I mean, what are the chances that a girl fleeing a blizzard would find shelter with a man who understood loss the way you do? What are the chances that someone who'd lost a child would be the one to help someone carrying a child? She placed her hand on her belly, which had grown noticeably rounder in the weeks since her arrival. It seems like more than coincidence. Samuel felt something stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Maybe it is more than coincidence, he said quietly. Margaret used to say that God worked in mysterious ways, that sometimes the things that looked like endings were really beginnings in disguise. Rose smiled, and Samuel felt his heart skip in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. Somewhere, in the weeks since her arrival, his feelings for Rose had begun to shift from protective concern to something deeper and more complicated. He found himself looking forward to her laughter, treasuring the moments when she would unconsciously hum while working, and feeling a fierce protectiveness that went far beyond simple hospitality. The realization that he was falling in love with Rose hit him like a bolt of lightning one morning in late December. She was making breakfast, moving around the kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there, when she suddenly stopped and pressed her hand to her back with a small grimace of discomfort. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked immediately. At her side, "Just a little backache," Rose said, but Samuel could see the strain in her face. "The baby's getting bigger, and sometimes ... Without thinking, Samuel moved behind her and began to massage the tight muscles along her spine, his hands working with the same gentle skill he used to calm injured animals. Rose relaxed under his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips, and Samuel became acutely aware of her warmth, her scent, the vulnerable curve of her neck beneath her loosely pinned hair. "Better?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Rose turned in his arms, and suddenly they were standing far closer than propriety dictated, her green eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Samuel thought she might kiss him, and he realized with startling clarity that he wanted her to more than he'd wanted anything in years. Instead, Rose stepped back, her cheeks flushed with color. "Thank you," she said softly. "That helped." The moment passed, but its implications lingered between them like smoke from a banked fire. Samuel found himself watching Rose more intently, noticing the graceful way she moved, despite her growing belly, the intelligence that sparked in her eyes when she was thinking deeply, the way she sometimes caught him looking at her and smiled with a mixture of shyness and something that might have been hope. Christmas arrived with little fanfare, but unexpected joy. Samuel had grown accustomed to ignoring the holiday, too painful a reminder of celebrations he'd shared with Margaret. But Rose approached the season with an enthusiasm that proved impossible to resist. She insisted on decorating the house with pine boughs and holly, and somehow she convinced Samuel to venture into the woods to cut down a small tree for the main room. "It doesn't have to be perfect," Rose said as they surveyed the slightly lopsided fir Samuel had selected. "It just has to be ours." The word "ours" sent a thrill through Samuel that he tried not to examine too closely. They spent the evening decorating the tree with ornaments Rose fashioned from scraps of fabric and bits of ribbon she'd found in Margaret's sewing basket. As they worked, Rose told him stories of Christmases from her childhood, painting pictures of a warmth and joy that made her family's eventual rejection of her seem all the more cruel. "My grandmother always said that Christmas was about making room in your heart for miracles," Rose said as she tied a small fabric angel to one of the tree's branches. She claimed that if you listened carefully on Christmas Eve, you could hear the angels singing the same song they sang the night Jesus was born. "Do you believe that?" Samuel asked. Rose was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her belly. "I used to. After Thomas died, I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. But lately..." She looked at Samuel with an expression that made his breath catch. "Lately I think I'm starting to believe in miracles again." That night, Samuel lay awake listening to the wind outside and thinking about miracles. Rose was asleep in the next room, and he could hear her moving restlessly, occasionally murmuring in her sleep. The sound filled him with a protectiveness so fierce it was almost painful. Somewhere in the space between autumn and winter, this woman and her unborn child had become the center of his universe in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. He thought about Margaret, about the love they'd shared, and the dreams that had died with her. For 3 years, he'd carried guilt over his inability to save her and their son, convinced that he'd somehow failed in his most fundamental duty as a husband and father. But Rose's presence in his life was forcing him to reconsider those assumptions. Perhaps some things were beyond human control. Perhaps love wasn't measured by the ability to prevent loss, but by the willingness to risk that loss in the first place. The next morning brought a surprise that changed everything. Samuel woke to find Rose already dressed and standing by the kitchen window, her face pale and tense as she watched the approaching figure of a rider cutting through the morning mist. "Someone's coming," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. Samuel joined her at the window, his own tension rising as he recognized the rider. Sheriff Coleman was a decent man, but his presence at the ranch could only mean trouble of one kind. Or another. "Stay inside," Samuel told Rose. "Let me handle this." But Rose shook her head, her jaw set with familiar stubbornness. "If this is about me, I have a right to know." Sheriff Coleman dismounted heavily, his expression grim as he approached the porch. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair, and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. He touched his hat brim respectfully as Samuel emerged from the house. "Morning, Samuel. I hope you're well enough. What brings you out here, Sheriff?" Coleman's eyes flicked to Rose, who had appeared in the doorway despite Samuel's instructions. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news, Miss McKenna. May I come in?" Rose's face went white, but she nodded and stepped aside. The three of them gathered around the kitchen table, and Samuel noticed that Rose's hands were trembling as she folded them in her lap. "There's been an incident in Millfield," Coleman began carefully. "Your father—" "He's dead, Miss McKenna." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Rose made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and Samuel instinctively reached for her hand. "How?" Rose whispered. "Drinking," Coleman said with obvious reluctance. "He'd been at it pretty hard since you left. Got into a fight at the saloon 3 nights ago. Other fellow pulled a knife." Rose sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. Samuel squeezed her hand, offering what comfort he could while his own mind raced with the implications of this news. "There's more," Coleman continued. "Your father left debts. Considerable debts. The bank's seizing the property to cover what he owed, but there are some personal effects." He pulled a small bundle from his coat. "Your mother wanted you to have these." Rose accepted the bundle with shaking hands. Inside were a few pieces of jewelry that had obviously belonged to her grandmother, including a delicate gold locket that she immediately clutched to her chest. "My mother," Rose said, her voice barely audible. "Is she?" "She's staying with her sister in Denver. Asked me to tell you that ... double quotes." Coleman paused, obviously uncomfortable. "She said to tell you that she's sorry, that she loves you, and she's sorry." After Coleman left, Rose collapsed into sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Samuel held her as she wept, feeling her pain as if it were his own. The irony was cruel. Just as Rose was beginning to build a new life, the past had reached out to remind her of everything she'd lost. "I hated him," Rose said through her tears. "I hated him for throwing me out, for choosing his pride over his daughter. But he was still my father, and now he's gone and I'll never have the chance to forgive him or to make things right." Samuel stroked her hair, searching for words that might offer comfort. "Sometimes forgiveness isn't about making things right with the other person," he said finally. "Sometimes it's about making things right with yourself." That night, Samuel found Rose standing by the window in Margaret's old sewing room, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. The moonlight turned her tear-stained face into something ethereal and beautiful, and Samuel felt his heart constrict with the depth of his feeling for her. "I keep thinking about all the things I never said to him," Rose said without turning around. "All the ways I could have been a better daughter, maybe prevented him from drowning his grief in drink." Samuel moved to stand behind her, close enough to feel her warmth, but not quite touching. "Your father made his own choices, Rose. You can't carry responsibility for his pain." Rose leaned back against him, and Samuel wrapped his arms around her, cradling her and the child she carried. "What if I'm making the same mistakes?" she whispered. "What if I'm so damaged by what happened to me that I can't be the mother this baby deserves?" Samuel turned her in his arms, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Rose McKenna, you are the strongest, kindest, most courageous woman I've ever known. Any child would be blessed to have you as a mother. How can you be so sure?" Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Because I've watched you gentle, frightened animals with nothing but patience and love. I've seen you turn a house of grief into a home filled with hope. I've felt the way you love that baby already, fierce and protective and pure." He paused, gathering courage for what he was about to say. "And because I've fallen in love with you. And I know that my heart wouldn't choose someone who wasn't worthy of all the love I have to give." Rose stared at him in shock, her lips parted in surprise. "Samuel ... I know it's too soon," Samuel said quickly. "I know you're grieving and vulnerable and probably not ready to hear this. But I needed you to know that you're not alone, that you're loved, and that whatever happens, I'll be here for you and that baby." Rose's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and kiss him. Soft and sweet and full of all the emotions neither of them had been brave enough to voice. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Samuel could see his own wonder reflected in Rose's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could love anyone after what happened to me, but you've shown me that my heart isn't as broken as I thought it was." They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other while the baby moved between them like a blessing. And Samuel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The miracle he'd prayed for hadn't come in the form he'd expected, but it had come nonetheless, wrapped in copper hair and green eyes and a courage that had survived the worst that life could offer. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, but inside the ranch house, two hearts that had known too much sorrow were finally learning to hope again. That January brought with it a cold so bitter that it seemed to freeze the very air in one's lungs, turning each breath into visible puffs of vapor that lingered like ghostly reminders of mortality. The ranch house creaked and groaned under the assault of Arctic winds that howled down from the mountains, carrying with them the promise that this winter would test the endurance of every living thing in the territory. But inside the sturdy log walls, Samuel and Rose had created a sanctuary of warmth that defied the brutal world beyond their door. Rose's pregnancy had progressed to the point where her condition could no longer be hidden or ignored. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo, one hand often resting on her swollen belly as if to reassure the child within that all was well. Samuel found himself constantly aware of her presence, his eyes following her movements with the protective intensity of a wolf guarding its mate. He had never experienced this peculiar mixture of joy and terror that came with loving someone who carried such vulnerability within her body. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Samuel rose before dawn to tend the animals, breaking ice on water troughs and hauling hay to the cattle that huddled together in the barn for warmth. Rose, now in her 8th month, had taken to rising later as her body demanded more rest, but Samuel always returned to find her already preparing breakfast with the efficient grace that had become so familiar to him. This morning, however, something was different. When Samuel entered the kitchen after his chores, he found Rose standing motionless at the window, her face pale and her hand pressed against the glass, as if she were trying to push through it to reach something beyond. "Rose?" Samuel approached her carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her breathing had become shallow and rapid. "What is it?" She turned to him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "There's someone coming. A woman on horseback. She's—" Rose's voice broke. "She's riding one of the horses from my family's farm. I'd recognize that mare anywhere." Samuel moved to the window and peered out at the approaching figure. Through the morning mist, he could make out a woman bundled in a heavy coat, her horse, picking its way carefully through the snow-covered ground. As she drew closer, Samuel could see that she was older, perhaps in her 40s, with graying hair that escaped from beneath her wool cap. "Do you know who it is?" Samuel asked, though. He suspected he already knew the answer from the way Rose's hands were trembling. "It's my Aunt Catherine," Rose whispered. "My mother's sister. The one who took Mother in after." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. This was the woman who had offered refuge to Rose's mother when the family fell apart. Samuel watched as the woman dismounted and approached the house with the determined stride of someone who had traveled far with a specific purpose. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of Rose, the same stubborn set of the shoulders, the same direct gaze that seemed to see right through pretense to the truth beneath. "She's come for me," Rose said, her voice barely audible. "She's come to take me back." Before Samuel could respond, a firm knock echoed through the house. Samuel squeezed Rose's hand reassuringly before moving to answer the door. The woman who stood on his porch was indeed formidable, with steel-gray eyes and a mouth set in lines that spoke of someone accustomed to difficult decisions. "You must be Samuel Holloway," she said without preamble. "I'm Catherine Sullivan, Rose's aunt. I've come to speak with my niece." Samuel stepped aside to allow her entry, noting the way her eyes immediately sought out Rose, who had moved to stand behind the kitchen table, as if it might provide some protection from whatever news her aunt had brought. "Rose," Catherine said, her voice softer now as she took in her niece's condition. "Oh, child, look at you." Rose lifted her chin with the defiance Samuel had come to recognize as one of her most endearing qualities. "If you've come to drag me back to face more judgment, you can save yourself the trouble. I won't go." Catherine's expression softened further, and she began to remove her coat with movements that suggested she intended to stay for more than a brief visit. "I haven't come to drag you anywhere, Rose. I've come to tell you the truth about what really happened to your family, and to ask for your forgiveness." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Samuel felt the atmosphere in the room shift dramatically. Rose's face went white, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. "What? Truth?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine looked between Rose and Samuel, then settled her gaze on her niece with the weight of someone preparing to unburden herself of a long-carried secret. "The truth about why your parents really cast you out. The truth about who your child's father really is. And the truth about what your mother has been hiding from you all these years." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. He moved closer to Rose, offering his presence as support for whatever revelation was about to unfold. "Sit down, Rose," Catherine said gently. "Please, this is going to be difficult to hear." Rose remained standing, her jaw set with stubborn determination. "I'm not fragile, Aunt Catherine. Whatever you have to say, just say it." Catherine sighed and took a seat at the table, her hands folded in her lap as she gathered her thoughts. "Your parents didn't cast you out because of shame over your condition, Rose. They cast you out because they were afraid." "Afraid of what?" Rose demanded. "Afraid of James Whitmore. Afraid of what he might do to all of you if you stayed." The name hit Rose like a physical blow. Samuel saw her stagger slightly, and he immediately moved to her side, his arm going around her waist to support her. James Whitmore, Rose repeated, her voice hollow. The banker's son. The one who's engaged to Senator Morrison's daughter. Catherine nodded grimly. The same James Whitmore who's been systematically destroying anyone who crosses him or threatens his political ambitions. The same James Whitmore who's been using his father's bank to foreclose on properties throughout the territory, including your family's farm. Samuel felt anger rising in his chest like a tide of fire. You're saying this man forced himself on Rose and then used his power to destroy her family? I'm saying worse than that, Catherine replied, her voice hard with suppressed fury. I'm saying that James Whitmore has been doing this for years, and that Rose wasn't his first victim. There have been others, young women from families without the power to fight back. Some of them have disappeared entirely. Others have been found. She paused, unable to finish the sentence. Rose made a strangled sound and would have fallen if Samuel hadn't been holding her. You're saying he's a killer? I'm saying he's a monster who's been protected by his family's wealth and influence. And when you refuse to disappear quietly, when you refuse to accept the money he offered to keep silent, he went to your father and made it clear that the entire family would suffer if you didn't leave Millfield immediately. The room seemed to spin around Samuel as the implications of Catherine's words sank in. Rose's father didn't throw her out because of shame. He threw her out to protect her. And to protect the rest of the family, Catherine confirmed. James made it clear that if Rose stayed, or if anyone in the family spoke about what he'd done, he would destroy them all. He had the power to do it too. He could have foreclosed on the farm, had Rose's father arrested on trumped-up charges. Made sure that none of them could find work anywhere in the territory. Rose was crying now, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. My father, she choked out. He was trying to protect me. And I hated him for it. I hated him right up until the day he died. Samuel held her tighter, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. The tragic irony of it was almost unbearable. Rose had spent months believing her father had rejected her out of shame, when in reality he had made the ultimate sacrifice to keep her safe. There's more, Catherine said quietly. Your mother. She's been working with a group of women in Denver, women who are trying to gather evidence against James Whitmore. They've been documenting his crimes, collecting testimony from his victims. They're building a case that might finally bring him to justice. Rose looked up at her aunt through her tears. But why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she try to contact me? Because she was afraid, Catherine said simply. Afraid that if James discovered where you were, he might come after you. She's been living in terror that he would find you, and she glanced at Rose's swollen belly, and that he would try to claim the child. The words sent a chill through Samuel that was colder than any winter wind. He wants the baby? Catherine nodded grimly. He's been telling people that he's the father of Rose's child, that she seduced him and then ran away when he tried to do the right thing. He's been painting himself as the wronged party, the noble young man who was taken advantage of by a scheming girl. That's a lie, Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. Of course it's a lie. But it's a lie that people want to believe because it's easier than confronting the truth about what kind of man James Whitmore really is. Catherine leaned forward, her expression urgent. He's been making inquiries, Samuel. Asking questions about where Rose might have gone. Offering rewards for information about her whereabouts. Samuel felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He's looking for her. He's looking for her, and he's getting closer. That's why I had to come. That's why I had to warn you. Catherine turned to Rose, her voice gentle but firm. You're not safe here anymore, Rose. None of us are safe as long as James Whitmore is free to hunt us down. Rose straightened slowly, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. What are you saying? That I should run again? That I should spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? I'm saying that we need to be smart about this. Your mother and the other women in Denver. They're close to having enough evidence to bring charges against James. But they need more time. And they need to know that you're safe while they work. Samuel looked between the two women, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. What kind of evidence do they have? Testimony from other victims. Financial records showing how James has been using his father's bank to silence people. Even some physical evidence in a few cases. Catherine's expression grew grim. But they need Rose's testimony to tie it all together. She's the only victim. Who can testify about the pattern of his behavior, about the threats he made to her family? Rose placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palm. I can't travel to Denver in my condition. I'm too close to my time. No, Catherine said. That's why I've come to you. Your mother and the others, they're willing to come here. To take your testimony here, where you're safe and comfortable. Samuel felt a surge of protectiveness that was almost overwhelming. And what happens after? She testifies. What happens when James Whitmore finds out that Rose has spoken against him? Catherine's expression was grave. Then we pray that justice is stronger than wealth and influence. And we prepare to fight if it isn't. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of wind around the house. Samuel looked at Rose, seeing the fear and determination warring in her green eyes. She was being asked to risk everything: her safety, her child's future, the peaceful life they had begun to build together, for the chance to stop a monster who had been preying on innocent women for years. I'll do it, Rose said quietly. I'll testify against him. Not just for me, but for all the other women he's hurt. For all the women he might hurt if he's not stopped. Samuel felt pride and terror in equal measure. Rose, you don't have to. Yes. I do, she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I've been running from this for too long. I've been letting fear make my decisions for me. But I'm not alone anymore, and I'm not powerless. I have something James Whitmore will never have. I have the truth. Catherine smiled for the first time since her arrival. Your mother will be so proud. You have her courage, Rose, and her stubbornness. When? Samuel asked. When will they come? Soon, Catherine replied. Within the week, if the weather holds. They're already on their way, traveling separately. To avoid suspicion. As the day wore on, Catherine shared more details about the case being built against James Whitmore. The picture that emerged was of a man who had used his family's power and wealth to prey on vulnerable women for years, always careful to choose victims who couldn't fight back, always ready to destroy anyone who threatened to expose him. But Rose's case was different. Rose had witnesses to some of the threats James had made. She had evidence of the way he had used his influence to destroy her family. Most importantly, she had refused to be silenced, even when silence would have been easier. That evening, as Catherine prepared to leave for the inn in the nearest town, she pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. She's going to need you, Catherine said quietly. What's coming? It's going to be harder than anything she's faced so far. James Whitmore isn't going to go down quietly, and he's going to try to destroy Rose's credibility in any way he can. Samuel nodded, his jaw set with determination. I'll protect her. Whatever it takes. Catherine studied his face for a long moment, then smiled slightly. I believe you will. And I think you're exactly what Rose needs, someone who sees her strength instead of her vulnerability. Someone who loves her enough to stand beside her instead of trying to shield her from the fight. As Catherine rode away into the gathering darkness, Samuel returned to the house to find Rose standing by the window, watching the snow fall in the lamplight. She looked fragile and fierce at the same time, like a warrior preparing for battle. Are you afraid? Samuel asked, moving to stand behind her. Terrified, Rose admitted, but also relieved. For the first time since this all began, I feel like I'm not running anymore. I'm fighting back. Samuel wrapped his arms around her, feeling the baby's movements between them. "We're fighting back," he corrected gently. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Rose leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. What if he comes here? What if James finds out where I am before the others arrive? Samuel's arms tightened around her protectively. Then he'll have to go through me to get to you. And I promise you, Rose McKenna, that's not going to happen without a fight that he'll never forget. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside the ranch house, too, people stood together in the lamplight, preparing to face whatever darkness might threaten the light they had found in each other. The battle for justice was about to begin, and neither of them had any intention of backing down. The women arrived like shadows against the snow, 3 figures on horseback cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with the purposeful silence of those who understood that their mission could mean the difference between justice and continued suffering. Samuel watched from the window as they approached, noting the way they rode, alert, cautious but determined. These were women who had learned to navigate a world that often dismissed their voices, and they carried themselves with the hard-won wisdom that came from fighting battles most people preferred to ignore. Rose's mother, Elena McKenna, was smaller than Samuel had expected, but there was a strength in her bearing that reminded him immediately of her daughter. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and lines of worry had etched themselves around her green eyes that were identical to Rose's. Beside her rode a stern-faced woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, introduced as Mrs. Victoria Hensley, a lawyer from Denver who had made it her mission to represent women who had nowhere else to turn. The third woman was younger, perhaps 30, with the kind of sharp intelligence that seemed to take in everything at once. She introduced herself simply as Sarah, and Samuel noticed that she carried herself with the careful control of someone who had survived her own encounter with James Whitmore. The reunion between Rose and her mother was both heartbreaking and healing to witness. Elena collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing apologies and begging forgiveness for choices that had been made out of fear rather than rejection. Rose wept as well, but her tears were cleansing rather than bitter, washing away months of believing herself unloved and unwanted. "I thought you hated me," Rose whispered against her mother's shoulder. "I thought you were ashamed of me." "Never," Elena said fiercely. "Never for one moment. Every day since you left, I've prayed that you were safe, that you'd found someone who could see what a treasure you are." She looked over Rose's shoulder at Samuel, who stood respectfully back from the reunion. "And it seems my prayers were answered." Mrs. Hensley was all business once the initial emotional reunions were complete. She spread papers across Samuel's kitchen table with the precision of a general planning a campaign, each document representing another piece of evidence in the case against James Whitmore. The picture that emerged was even more damning than what Catherine had revealed, a pattern of abuse that stretched back nearly a decade, touching the lives of at least 15 women that they knew of, and likely many more who had been too frightened or broken to come forward. "James Whitmore has been protected by more than just his family's wealth," Mrs. Hensley explained as she organized the testimonies. "He's been careful to choose victims from families without social standing, women who could be easily discredited if they tried to speak out. But he made a mistake with Rose." "What kind of mistake?" Samuel asked, settling into a chair beside Rose and taking her hand for support. "He targeted someone with witnesses. Someone whose family's destruction could be traced directly back to his threats. And someone," she looked at Rose with obvious respect, "who refused to disappear quietly into the shadows." Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. "There's something else you need to know. James hasn't just been looking for Rose out of spite or to silence her. He genuinely believes he has a legal claim to her child." The words sent ice through Samuel's veins. "What do you mean?" "Colorado territorial law gives fathers certain rights over their children, even in cases of ... Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. Even in cases like this, James has been telling people that he and Rose were engaged, that she ran away, rather than face the scandal of bearing a child out of wedlock. He's been painting himself as the wronged party who's trying to do the right thing by claiming his son. Rose's hand tightened in Samuel's grip. He can't do that. He can't just take my baby. Not if we can prove what he really is, Mrs. Hensley said firmly. That's why your testimony is so crucial, Rose. You're not just speaking for yourself, you're speaking for every woman he's hurt and every woman he might hurt in the future. They spent the morning going over Rose's testimony, with Mrs. Hensley guiding her through the painful process of recounting every detail of her encounters with James Whitmore. Rose's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the act of finally telling her story to people who believed her was giving her back power she hadn't realized she'd lost. Samuel found himself burning with rage as he listened to the details Rose had never shared with him, the way James had cornered her after church socials, the gifts he'd forced on her family to ensure their cooperation, the threats he'd made when Rose had tried to resist his advances. But alongside the anger was pride in Rose's courage, in her refusal to be broken by a man who had crushed so many others. It was while they were taking a break for lunch that the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the careful calm they had built around their work. Samuel looked out the window and felt his blood freeze in his veins. A group of riders was approaching, at least 6 men, all armed, with James Whitmore himself at their head. "He's here," Samuel said quietly, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water. Rose went pale but straightened her shoulders with characteristic determination. "How did he find us?" Mrs. Hensley was already gathering the papers, stuffing them into a leather satchel with practiced efficiency. "Someone must have seen us arriving, or maybe he's been watching the roads. It doesn't matter now. What matters is protecting you and the evidence." Samuel moved to the gun cabinet, retrieving his rifle and checking that it was loaded. "Rose, take your mother and the others to the back room. Bar the door and don't come out no matter what you hear." "I'm not hiding," Rose said, her chin set with familiar stubbornness. "You're not hiding, you're protecting our child," Samuel corrected, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't about courage, Rose. This is about making sure you live to see justice." "Done." Before Rose could argue further, a knock echoed through the house, not the polite rap of a friendly visitor, but the demanding pound of someone accustomed to having doors opened at his command. Samuel moved to answer it, his rifle held ready but not obviously threatening. Through the window, he could see James Whitmore clearly for the first time. The man was younger than Samuel had expected, perhaps 25, with the kind of polished, good looks that came from a lifetime of privilege and comfort. His clothes were expensive, his horse well-bred, and his bearing carried the arrogant confidence of someone who had never been told no. But there was something cold in his pale blue eyes, something predatory that made Samuel's skin crawl. "Mr. Holloway," James said when Samuel opened the door, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a politician. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't believe we've been introduced," Samuel replied evenly, not moving aside to allow James entry. "James Whitmore," the younger man said, as if his name should carry weight and recognition. "I've come for my fiancée and my unborn child." Samuel felt anger flare in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. There's no one here by that description." James's facade of politeness slipped slightly, revealing the cruel nature beneath. "Don't play games with me, Holloway. I know Rose McKenna is here. I have witnesses who saw her arrive, and I have every legal right to claim what's mine." "The only thing you have a right to claim is a place in hell," Samuel said quietly. "And if you don't get off my property in the next 10 seconds, I'll be happy to send you there ahead of schedule." James laughed, but the sound held no humor. "You're threatening me?" Do you have any idea who I am? What I could do to you? I know exactly who you are, Samuel replied. You're a coward who preys on women who can't fight back. You're a liar who uses his family's money to silence the people you've hurt. And you're a fool if you think you can come onto my land and threaten my family. The word family seemed to hit James like a physical blow. His face darkened with rage, and Samuel could see the man's true nature emerging from behind the polished facade. Your family? James snarled. That whore isn't your family. The bastard she's carrying isn't your family. They belong to me, and I'm taking them back where they belong. Samuel's finger moved to his rifle's trigger. The only place you're going is back where you came from, and you're going now. James gestured to his men, and Samuel could see them spreading out, surrounding the house. I don't think you understand the situation you're in, Holloway. I have 6 armed men with me, and you're alone. Be smart about this. Hand over Rose and the child when it's born, and I'll make sure you're compensated for your hospitality. The only thing you're going to get from me is a bullet between the eyes if you don't leave, Samuel said. This is your last warning. From behind him, Samuel heard Rose's voice, strong and clear despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. Let me talk to him, Samuel. Rose, no. It's all right, she said, moving to stand beside him. Samuel could see that Mrs. Hensley and the others had positioned themselves strategically around the room, ready to defend Rose if necessary. I need to face him. I need him to hear what I have to say. Rose stepped onto the porch, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Even heavy with child and dressed in simple frontier clothing, she carried herself with a dignity that made James's expensive finery look cheap and tawdry by comparison. Hello, James, she said quietly. James's expression shifted as he took in her appearance, his eyes lingering on her pregnant form with a mixture of possessiveness and disgust that made Samuel's stomach turn. Rose, James said, his voice taking on a falsely gentle tone. You look well. I've been so worried about you disappearing the way you did. Your condition, traveling alone in winter, it was dangerous and foolish. No more dangerous than staying where you could find me, Rose replied evenly. James's mask slipped again. You're being dramatic. I offered to do the right thing by you, to give our child a name and a future. Instead, you ran off to play house with this this nobody. This nobody, Rose said, her voice growing stronger, has shown me more kindness and respect in a few months than you showed me in all the time you were forcing your attention on me. Forcing? James laughed, but the sound was ugly. You didn't seem to mind my attention when I was bringing gifts to your family, when I was helping your father with his debts. You mean when you were bribing my family and threatening to destroy them if I didn't submit to you, Rose corrected. When you were making it clear that refusing you would mean starvation and ruin for everyone I loved. Samuel could see James's control beginning to crack completely. The man's face was flushed with rage, and his hand had moved to rest on the pistol at his hip. Enough of this, James snarled. You're coming with me, Rose. You and the child belong to me, and I'm tired of playing games. If this fool tries to stop me, my men will put him in the ground. I'm not going anywhere with you, Rose said firmly, and neither is my child. Your child? James's voice rose to a near shriek. That bastard is mine. I put it in you, and I'll decide what happens to it. The words were a mistake, the kind of revealing slip that showed James's true nature to anyone listening. But they also pushed him past the point of rational thought, and Samuel could see the man's hand moving toward his gun. Everything happened in the space of a heartbeat. James drew his pistol, his face twisted with rage as he aimed it at Rose. Samuel brought up his rifle, but he knew he wouldn't be fast enough to stop James from firing. Time seemed to slow as Samuel watched the man's finger tighten on the trigger. The shot that rang out across the snow-covered yard didn't come from James's gun. It came from the second-story window of the house where Elena McKenna had positioned herself with Samuel's spare rifle. The bullet took James in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the snow. The moment of stunned silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Hensley's voice, clear and authoritative, as she stepped onto the porch with a document in her hand. "James Whitmore," she called out, "you are under arrest for assault, rape, extortion, and conspiracy. I am an officer of the Territorial Court, and I have warrants for your arrest, signed by Judge Morrison himself." James clutched his wounded shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. "You can't." "Morrison won't. He's going to be my father-in-law. Judge Morrison has seen the testimony of 15 women you've assaulted," Mrs. Hensley continued, "including detailed accounts of the threats you made to their families and the way you've used your father's bank to silence your victims. He's also seen the evidence of your attempt to claim illegal custody of children born from your assaults." The fight seemed to go out of James all at once. His men, seeing their leader wounded and facing legal charges, began to back away, unwilling to compound their troubles by continuing to follow his orders. Samuel kept his rifle trained on James as Mrs. Hensley approached with shackles. "It's over, Whitmore. Your reign of terror ends today." As they secured James and prepared to transport him back to Denver for trial, Samuel felt Rose's hand slip into his. She was trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Is it really over?" she asked. Samuel squeezed her hand, looking into her green eyes that now held hope instead of fear. "It's really over. You're free, Rose. You and our child are finally free." The word "our" had slipped out naturally, and Samuel saw Rose's eyes fill with tears of joy as she realized what he'd said. Their child, their family, their future, no longer shadowed by the darkness of James Whitmore's threats. As the last of the riders disappeared into the distance, taking James toward the justice he had so long avoided, Samuel and Rose stood together on the porch of their home, watching the sun break through the clouds for the first time in days. The storm was finally over, and they could begin to build the life they had dreamed of in whispered conversations. By the fireplace, the miracle Rose carried within her was safe, and the family they had chosen was complete. Spring came early too. Colorado Territory that year, as if the land itself was eager to wash away the darkness of the winter that had nearly destroyed so many lives. The snow melted with unusual haste, revealing green shoots pushing through the rich soil and wildflowers blooming in meadows that had been barren just weeks before. On the Holloway Ranch, the transformation was even more dramatic. What had been a place of mourning and isolation had become a thriving home filled with the sounds of life and the promise of futures yet to be written. Rose's labor began on a morning when the air smelled of apple blossoms and fresh grass, when the world seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of new life. Samuel had been expecting it for days, watching for signs and preparing everything he could think of to ensure that this birth would be different from the tragedy that had claimed Margaret and their son. Dr. Harrison had arrived from Denver 3 days earlier, a skilled physician who specialized in difficult births, and who came with the highest recommendations from Mrs. Hensley's network of supporters. The labor was long but not dangerous, with Rose showing the same stubborn strength that had carried her through every other challenge she'd faced. Samuel stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand during the difficult moments and offering encouragement when her strength began to flag. Alina was there too, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter bring new life into the world with a courage that took Samuel's breath away. When the baby's first cry echoed through the ranch house, Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight band of grief he'd carried for 3 years, replaced by a joy so pure and overwhelming that it nearly brought him to his knees. The child was perfect, healthy, and strong, with a powerful voice that seemed to announce his intention to make his presence known to anyone within miles. Thomas Samuel, Rose whispered as Dr. Harrison placed the baby in her arms. "Look at him, Samuel. Look at our son." The word "our" was deliberate and meaningful, a gift that Rose gave to Samuel in front of everyone present. This child would be his in every way that mattered, raised with love and protection, never knowing the shadow of the man who had fathered him through violence. Samuel reached out with trembling fingers to touch the baby's tiny hand, amazed when small fingers immediately curled around his own with surprising strength. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home, son." The weeks that followed the birth were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy, of learning to navigate the needs of a newborn while adjusting to their new reality as a family. Samuel threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he'd once brought to ranching, changing diapers with the same careful attention he'd used to tend injured cattle, and walking the floors at night with Thomas cradled against his chest. While Rose recovered her strength, the legal proceedings against James Whitmore had moved swiftly once he was in custody. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempted assault on Rose in front of witnesses had only strengthened the case. Judge Morrison, horrified to learn of the crimes his future son-in-law had been committing, had thrown his full support behind the prosecution. James's engagement to the senator's daughter had been broken immediately, and his family's bank was facing federal investigation for its role in silencing his victims. Mrs. Hensley visited the ranch regularly to update them on the case's progress, and each report brought better news. Other victims had come forward, emboldened by Rose's courage in speaking out. James faced charges in multiple territories, ensuring that even if he somehow escaped conviction in one jurisdiction, justice would find him in another. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, Mrs. Hensley told them during one of her visits, bouncing Thomas on her knee while Rose and Samuel shared a moment of quiet satisfaction. And more importantly, he'll never hurt another woman again. The vindication was sweet, but sweeter still was the growing realization that they were truly free to build the life they'd dreamed of. Samuel had begun expanding the ranch's operations, using some of the reward money that had been offered for James's capture to purchase additional cattle and hire more hands. The Broken Arrow Ranch was becoming prosperous again, but more than that, it was becoming a place of healing. Elena had decided to stay permanently, building a small cottage on the property where she could be close to her daughter and grandson while maintaining her independence. The relationship between mother and daughter, nearly destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, had not only healed but grown stronger through their shared ordeal. One evening in late spring, as Samuel and Rose sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold while Thomas slept peacefully in Rose's arms, Samuel broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about making some changes around here." Rose looked at him with curiosity. "What kind of changes?" Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, his heart hammering against his ribs as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single emerald that matched Rose's eyes perfectly. "The kind of changes that would make you Mrs. Holloway officially, if you'll have me." Rose's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the ring, then at Samuel's face, which showed every ounce of love and hope he'd been carrying in his heart. Samuel ... "I know it might seem fast," Samuel said quickly, "and I know you've been through so much that the idea of marriage might not appeal." Rose silenced him by leaning over to kiss him, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby in her arms. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Samuel could see his own wonder reflected in her green eyes. "Yes," Rose whispered, "yes, I'll marry you. I'll be proud to be Mrs. Holloway, and proud to have Thomas grow up with your name and your values." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the meadow behind the ranch house where Margaret was buried. It seemed fitting to Samuel that his new beginning should take place so close to where he'd laid his first love to rest, as if Margaret was giving her blessing to the happiness he'd found with Rose. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, officiated by the traveling preacher who made regular circuits through the territory. Elena wept happy tears as she watched her daughter exchange vows with the man who had given them both a second chance at life. Thomas, now 2 months old and growing stronger every day, slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms throughout the ceremony, as if he knew he was witnessing the formal creation of his family. Sheriff Coleman attended, along with Jake Martinez, and several of the ranch hands, who had become like family over the years. Mrs. Hensley had traveled from Denver for the occasion, bringing with her the news that James Whitmore had been sentenced to 25 years in prison and would likely never see freedom again. As Samuel and Rose exchanged rings and promised to love and protect each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, Samuel felt the last of his grief over Margaret's death finally settle into its proper place, not forgotten, but transformed into gratitude for the love they'd shared and the way that love had prepared him to love again. The reception was held in the ranch house, with Elena's cooking providing a feast that had everyone talking about it for weeks afterward. As the evening wore on and the guests gradually departed, Samuel found himself standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, watching Rose feed Thomas while she chatted with her mother about plans for expanding the herb garden. Scene was so perfectly domestic, so completely opposite to the emptiness that had filled this house just a year ago, that Samuel had to blink back tears of gratitude. He thought about the night Rose had arrived, desperate, pregnant, fleeing through a blizzard toward an uncertain future. He thought about his own state of mind then, buried alive in grief and convinced that his capacity for happiness had died with Margaret. Now, Thomas was gurgling contentedly in his mother's arms. Rose was laughing at something Elena had said, and the house was filled with the kind of warmth that came from people who had chosen to love each other despite all the reasons the world had given them not to trust. A year later, the Holloway Ranch had become something of a legend throughout the territory. Samuel and Rose had established what they called the New Beginnings program, offering sanctuary and employment to women who found themselves in situations similar to what Rose had faced. The ranch provided not just shelter, but job training, legal assistance, and most importantly, a community of people who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. Mrs. Hensley had helped them navigate the legal complexities of such an undertaking, ensuring that they had proper protections in place and connections to law enforcement agencies that could help when needed. The program had grown beyond anything they'd initially imagined, with women arriving from as far away as California and Texas, drawn by word-of-mouth stories of the Colorado ranch where second chances were not just possible but encouraged. Thomas, now walking and beginning to form his first words, had grown into a sturdy, happy child who showed no signs of the violence that had brought him into existence. He followed Samuel around the ranch like a devoted shadow, his face lighting up whenever his father appeared, and babbling contentedly in the special language that exists between parents and their children. One evening, as Samuel was teaching Thomas to feed the chickens, a task that involved more giggling and chasing than actual feeding, Rose appeared in the doorway of the henhouse with news that made Samuel's heart skip with joy and terror in equal measure. "We're going to have another baby," she said simply, her hand resting on her still flat belly with the same protective gesture she'd used during her pregnancy with Thomas. Samuel stared at her for a moment, chicken feed forgotten in his hands, before breaking into a grin that threatened to split his face in half. "Are you sure?" Dr. Harrison confirmed it this morning when he was here checking on Mrs. Patterson's baby, Rose said, referring to one of the women currently staying at the ranch. "He says everything looks perfect." Samuel swept her into his arms, spinning her around while Thomas clapped his hands in delight at what he obviously thought was a new game. When Samuel finally set Rose down, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. "When?" Samuel asked, his hands already moving to rest on her belly in wonder. "Christmas," Rose said. Dr. Harrison thinks the baby will arrive right around Christmas. The timing seemed perfect to Samuel, the Christmas baby, born into a family that had learned to celebrate miracles in all their forms. As he held Rose close while Thomas tugged at his pants leg, demanding attention, Samuel thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The grief, the loss, the desperate flight through a blizzard, the courage to face down monsters and fight for justice, all of it had led to this perfect moment of pure happiness. That night, after Thomas was asleep and they had shared the happy news with Elena, Samuel and Rose sat on their porch swing watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The ranch spread out before them in peaceful silence, with lights glowing in the windows of the cottages, where their extended family of survivors and staff were settling in for the night. Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if that storm hadn't driven me to your door? Rose asked, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. But then I realize that maybe the storm didn't drive you here by accident. Maybe Margaret was right about miracles. Maybe they come disguised as troubles we don't think we can handle. Rose lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. You think Margaret had something to do with us finding each other? Samuel smiled, thinking about his first wife's unshakable faith in the power of love to transcend even death. I think Margaret would be happy that her house is filled with love and laughter again. I think she'd be proud of the family we've built and the good we're doing for others. Rose settled back against his shoulder, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her belly where their second child was just beginning to grow. I hope this baby has your eyes, she said sleepily. I hope this baby has your courage, Samuel replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. As they sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their ranch and feeling the perfect contentment that came from lives well lived and love freely given, Samuel reflected on the miracle that had transformed his world. He had been a man buried alive in grief, and Rose had been a woman fleeing certain destruction. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a family bound not by blood, but by choice, a home built on the foundation of second chances, and a legacy that would continue to grow with each life they touched. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, witnesses to countless human stories of love and loss, hope and despair. But on this night, they looked down on a ranch house in Colorado Territory, where two people who had found each other in the darkness were building something bright, enough to light the way for others still searching for their own miracles. Thomas's first word, spoken the next morning as Samuel lifted him from his crib, was Papa, and Samuel knew that Margaret had been right all along. Love really was stronger than death. Hope really could triumph over despair. And sometimes the most beautiful beginnings grew from the most devastating endings.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.